Welcome to the Miqra today. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, saints of the Most High.
Saints, hallelujah.
Hallelujah. We are the holy ones of Elohim because we are separating ourselves according to His call. He calls us to be holy just as He is holy. And that means separated from sin. We need to forsake all the things of the past, the way we used to live, the doctrines we believed in, the traditions that we did year after year, and the nonsense that we engaged in, and be a people separated, set apart unto the Most High Elohim to do what's pleasing to Him. We need to be children of light and no longer walking in the darkness. So hallelujah. Welcome, saints of the Most High.
Hallelujah.
Welcome. And let's have some fellowship over the Word today. Part 2 of the Sermon on the Mount is our topic. Messiah upholds the Torah and the prophets. Last week we began with the first half of Matthew chapter 5, and we saw that Messiah was presenting to His disciples a teaching about the Torah and the prophets. And we're going to see the same theme. Did you know that the Sermon on the Mount is all about Messiah Yahushua showing us that He is upholding the Torah and the prophets? He's not tearing it down. He's not doing away with it. He's not setting it aside. He's not going to diminish it in any way. But these are the Father's words, and these are the Father's commandments that He's given us through the Torah and the prophets. And the Messiah, as the true prophet from Elohim, the prophet like Moshe, was going to come, and He was going to give us insight and understanding into the things that the Father has given us. And so it makes perfect sense that the Messiah would uphold the Torah and the prophets. These are the very words of life that the Father gave. And David in Psalm 119, over and over, what are there, 178 verses in Psalm 119, and over in each verse, except for maybe one or two, he gives thanks to Yahweh for His commandments. They're our guardians. They're righteous, they're spiritual, they uphold us, they bring us into the path of life. And so the commandments are Yahweh's will for our lives. And they're good and they're righteous. And so David praises the Father for the commandments. And Moshe praised the Father for the commandments too. And we should be praising the Father for His commandments. Messiah in the Sermon on the Mount is going to uphold the Torah and the prophets. And every step of the way, we're going to see the Messiah saying, in the section today we're going to cover, He's going to say, you have heard it said from those of old, or by those of old. And he's giving a kind of a generalization of what men taught in the past about the Father's commandments. And then He says, but I am telling you this. And He gives us, He digs a little deeper and He shows us the intent of the Torah and the prophets, and He shows us the real deeper meaning of the Torah and the prophets. Like I said earlier, it's not just, it is the outward actions that we take. The Torah addresses many issues of our outward behavior, but the Torah also addresses the inward person, the heart of the man, and what our mind is thinking, and it addresses those things too. And it calls us to have pure thoughts, not to hate our brother, but to love our brother. And on a variety of other topics, Messiah brings us deep into the Torah and explains these things. So, let's get into it. Today we're going to look at teaching on murder to begin with. Matthew 5:21 through 22 says this, you heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that whoever is wroth or angry with his brother without a cause shall be liable to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, shall be liable to the Sanhedrin, which is the judging body in Israel. But whoever says, you fool, shall be liable to fire, the fire of Gehenna. And so here are the commandments that the Torah gives us about murder and being angry. when he said, "You have heard it said by to those of old. This Greek phrase can be translated, you heard that it was said by those of old. And I'm really at a conundrum as to which is the better translation, because both are really true. It was said by those of old. In other words, he's referring to what the rabbis and the sages and the leaders in Israel taught as the meaning and the application of the Torah. But these men also spoke to those of old. In other words, this has been the traditional teaching of what is now the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees and the rabbis. And so he answers by saying, but I say to you. And so he's going to give his authoritative interpretation of these commandments that are given in the Torah. And Elohim spoke all these words in Exodus, Shemot. Shemot is a Hebrew name for Exodus. It means names, Shemot. We talk about the Shem Yahuwah, the name of Yahuwah. Shemot is the plural form. And the first verse of Exodus says, these are the names of the sons of Israel that came down into Egypt. And so the Hebrew name is Shemot. I'm saying it so that we become more and more familiar with these names of the Old Testament Bible books. Exodus 20, chapter 1, and Elohim spoke all these words. And verse 13, he says, you shall not murder. The Hebrew word utilized here, ratzah, or ratzach, means to slay with premeditation. It doesn't cover all killings. This is a specific kind of killing that is prohibited by the Torah. It's talking about the intentional taking of a man's life without sufficient cause. There are cases in which putting someone to death is not ratzach. There are other times, death in war is permissible because Father calls us to defeat our enemies. He's using his people to destroy others, other nations and so forth that will not repent and turn to his word. So he has to snuff them out, as it were. So death in war is not what's being talked about here in this, the sixth commandment, you shall not murder. Neither is accidental manslaying. There are cases where, like when the axe flies off the handle and it hits somebody, there's an example of that in the Torah. The person who was wielding the axes has not committed ratzach. He's not murdered intentionally. It was unintentional. It was an accident. And there were places where people could go to be protected from somebody from the family that would want to come and seek revenge against that person, because it was not done intentionally. And then there are also death penalty deaths, where Father told the sons of Israel to put someone to death because of their rebellion. That putting to death is not ratzach. It was a commanded slaying of somebody that Father wanted to put to death. So ratzach means to slay with premeditation. In other words, when one becomes angry and can no longer control themselves, and they use blunt force or some other instrument to intentionally put somebody to death, this is prohibited by the Torah. And so the Messiah says, but I say to you that whoever is wroth with his brother without a cause, and that's why he says without a cause, because ratzach means putting to death without sufficient cause. Okay? So Messiah repeats that. He kind of gives the definition of the murder being described here in how he describes how he's interpreting. Whoever is wroth with his brother without a cause shall be liable to judgment. And whoever says raka shall be liable to the Sanhedrin. Whoever says fool shall be liable to the fire of Gehenna. So the Torah speaks to the sins of the mind. Yahusha's answer here about the deeper meaning of that commandment is about what a man thinks, about what is in a man's heart. And yet these things are what the Torah also teaches. So the Torah, again, to repeat, and this is an important point, the Torah teaches commandments that that regulate our actions, but also regulate our thoughts and our mind. If we have the mind of Messiah, we're going to do the things that pleases him. But if we have our own mind and we have our own thoughts and claim to have the mind of Messiah, then we're double-minded. We can't have our own mind anymore unless we want to be double-minded. And we're told not to be double-minded. If we have the mind of Messiah, we will no longer rely upon our own mind and our own thoughts, but we will rely upon his ways and his thoughts. And let our actions, all of our thoughts are going to be in conformity with his ways and his thinking, and therefore we will be keeping the commandments because we will be doing what pleases him. The rabbis taught a surface level of the commands, while Yahusha drilled down further to show the thoughts that lead one to commit these sins. And the Torah also digs into that if we search a little further. The thoughts are also sins according to Torah. And I don't know if we all realize that, but our thoughts can be transgressions of the Torah. And we can hide those thoughts by not carrying out the action behind those thoughts. And we can think, well, nobody knows what's really in my heart. I hate my brother, and I wish he were dead. But I'm not going to carry that out because I have to put on airs, like I'm really in the will of Elohim. And so we can conceal those things. But the Almighty sees it, and he still considers and reckons evil thoughts as transgression of his Torah. So there's an area that we need to clean up in our lives if we haven't already done so. We need to be ever mindful of the fact that the Father knows our thoughts and he knows our heart. And what does that other verse say about the heart? The heart is deceitfully wicked. When we say, oh, the Father knows my heart, I might not be doing this commandment, but the Father knows my heart. Well, yeah, he does know your heart, and if your heart is evil, then that's transgression, and we need to clean that up. We need to repent of those evil thoughts and the wickedness that is sometimes in the heart. All right, so here's a commandment that digs deeper, and this is what Yahusha was referring to. In Vayikra, Leviticus, Vayikra means, and he called. And he called. And it's in the first verse or two of the book of Leviticus, and he called. So Vayikra chapter 19 says this, you must not walk about as a slanderer among your people. Slandering is an expression of hatred toward your brother or toward any individual, even somebody who's not your brother. We cannot be slanderers and have that intimate connection with the Almighty. They don't fit together. You can't have both together. You can't be a slanderer. You must not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is at stake. I am Yahweh. You can't just watch somebody dying and do nothing about it. You must not hate your brother in your heart. So each of these commandments, and especially this one, I think, is what Yahusha was referring to here when he said, do not be wroth with your brother. I say to you, do not be wroth with your brother, because you'll be liable to judgment. The judgment comes on account of all the transgressions of the Torah. And if we hate our brother in our heart, that's a transgression of the Torah. Whether you're hiding it well or not, Father sees it and will judge. He'll judge that. You must surely reprove your fellow citizens so that you do not incur sin on account of him. You must not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the children of your people, but you must love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. So there it is. It's this inward hard attitude we have toward people. Slandering, that has an outward expression. Hating in the heart, we can hide that, but it's still transgression. Taking vengeance or bearing a grudge, those things are usually noticed. When we bear a grudge, we have a chip on our shoulder. People recognize that, and we can see that for what it is. And so all of these attitudes of the heart are part of what the Torah teaching. teaches, and they lead inevitably, unless it's contained or controlled or repented of, these things lead to murder. And that's why it's important to recognize the attitude of the heart is something that we need to take care of. So, Yahusha goes on in verses 23 and 24, he says, "If then you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother holds whatever against you, leave your gift there before the altar, and go first make peace with your brother, and then come and offer your gifts." And when he's talking about bringing a gift, these could be peace offerings, these can be extra gifts that we bring to Father in order to show our love for him. And there were ways that people could do that. Other than just the sin offering and the guilt offering, there were other offerings that one could bring in order to give thanks. The thank offerings, the shalom offerings. So bringing your gift presupposes that all else has been taken care of, that you come with clean hands. Because again, the two can't go together. We can't have fellowship with the Almighty while we're holding hatred in our heart against our brother. And so if your brother has something against you, or even in another place it says, or you have something against your brother, you can't offer your gift at the altar right now, because the Father doesn't receive that. I mean, you could offer it, but the Father's not going to, it's not going to count for what you wanted it to count for. Because you have broken fellowship with the Father because you have a grudge or an issue with your brother, or your brother has a grudge or an issue with you. And so you set that gift down and you go make it right with your brother. You have to clear the air in these issues, because the Father sees the heart. And so once we've cleared the air, once we've made it right with our brother, then we can come and offer the gift, and he'll receive it for what we intend it to be, an offering of thanks and an offering of fellowship with the Almighty. He next says, be well-minded with your opponent. Your opponent, this could be translated accuser or enemy, even sometimes. Be well-minded, and that means to be of a good mind, to make friends with or get favor with. Benevolence is the idea, is making it right. And it follows up on the verse before, where you're supposed to make it right with your brother before you bring your gift. And here he says, be well-minded, or be at peace, make friends with, reconcile with your opponent promptly while you are on the way with him, lest your opponent deliver you to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. If you're guilty of some sort of wrongdoing toward your brother, and it's something that the judges will look at and judge and make some sort of decision about, if you owe your brother something, if you took something, any of these things that you might do to offend your brother or to do wrong to your brother, the Messiah is telling us to make that right quickly before he takes you to the judge and you get judged for it and then have to go to prison or pay the price or whatever. And that price might be, the judges might decide that it'd be a higher price to pay than what you, by going to your brother and making it right with your brother, might have had to return to your brother. In other words, you would negotiate. If you would go to your brother and over an offense and you negotiate, let's make this right, let's make it good between us, then you take care of that. But if you don't take care of it, and your brother is still angry at you for the offense you did to him, he's going to take you to the judges, and the judges probably going to be a little harsher on you to make it right with your brother. So we're instructed to be well-minded with our opponent quickly before the situation gets out of hand. Okay, so that's all I have on anger and murder. Moving on to the next topic, Yahusha addresses the issue of adultery in verses 27 and 28. You heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone looking at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And again, this isn't a new interpretation. It's not a new law. It's the old law that Yahusha is referring to here. Looking at a woman to lust for her is committing adultery in the heart. Let's look at those commandments. You shall not commit adultery. Shemot. What does that mean? Shemot. Names, yeah, Shemot, or Exodus 20, verse 14. You shall not commit adultery. But just a few verses later, 3 verses later, you shall not covet, desire, or take pleasure in your neighbor's wife. That's one of the big 10, is what's in your heart toward your neighbor's wife. And so Yahusha wasn't introducing a new commandment here, that if you lust after your neighbor's wife in your heart, then you're committing adultery in your heart. No, this is an old commandment, and he's just bringing it out and making it obvious that even if you're not committing adultery, and this is a hard one because I know men struggle with this, even believers, not to lust after your neighbor's wife. We cannot do that. We cannot do that and be right before the Father. There are so many things the world flashes in front of us, on the TVs, on billboards, everywhere you go, on the internet. There's stuff that is trying to draw your attraction toward a woman. Okay? And so that's what the world is trying to bring us to. That's what our enemy wants us to do, is to sin in our heart, because he knows eventually that sin is going to break out into a physical, sexual sin and committing adultery. So these are sins of action and sins of the mind. The Torah contains, again, both prohibitions against sins of action and sins of the mind. If your right eye, Yahusha continues, if your right eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it away from you. And at first blush, he seems to be referring to the eye, the right eye, as looking with lust toward your neighbor's wife. And that is a proper interpretation. But hold that thought and let's look at another possibility here in just a minute. For it is better for you that one of your members perish than for your entire body to be thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away from you. For it is better for you that one of your members perish than for your entire body to be thrown into Gehenna. So when he said your right eye, he could be referring to, kind of tailing right off of what he said about lusting after your neighbor's wife as a sin of the Torah, sin, a transgression against Torah. When he says right hand implies some other sort of action, not just lusting. So he's talking here in this section about more than just lusting. When he says right eye, cut off your right eye, cut off your right hand. What could he possibly be talking about or alluding to here? What does the Torah teach? Purging the evil. A radical approach it is if the Messiah is telling us to cut your right eye out or to cut your hand off. Because that doesn't really take care of the problem, does it? Of lusting or of doing wrong. If we cut members off of our body, it doesn't really take care of the issue. So I'm suggesting that he's not really specifically telling us to cut members off because we sin. There's something else he's talking about here. And it's about purging the evil. Is this a body metaphor reference to something else? Remember, we talked about the body metaphor in Paul's writings. He used the body as a metaphor for the body, the people of Elohim. Okay? So this is the body. So remembering Devarim, or Deuteronomy chapter 13, Devarim means words. Devarim words. I'll test you on that a little bit later too. Shemot means names. Vayikra means and he called. And now Devarim means words. These are the words that Moses presented. Okay, so Deuteronomy 13. We're talking about the prophet who would come. This prophet who had dreams or visions, and then he tries to lead people away to worship other Elohim. He tries to lead us away from obedience to the commandments and of fearing and obeying Yahweh our Elohim. And he says that prophet, here's where we pick up in this verse, that prophet or dreamer must be put to death because he has preached rebellion against Yahweh your Elohim who brought you out of Mitzrayim or Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. He has tried to turn you from the way Yahweh your Elohim commanded you to follow. You must purge the evil from among you. And this expression, I've underlined it, you must purge the evil from among you. It's repeated over and over again in the Torah when it talks about judging these sins that are occurring in the camp. You must purge the evil from among you. And in this case, it's putting this member to death. Are you a right eye? Are you a right hand? Are you a leg or a foot or whatever? Whatever member we are in the body, this I believe is what Yahushua is alluding to. It's about purging the evil from among you. So if you have a brother who refuses to repent of his sin, then you must purge the evil from among you. In some cases it's death, the death penalty. In some cases it's excommunication. It's separating from him or separating him out from among you so that the evil that he's trying to bring in and won't repent of doesn't spread throughout the community like leaven in bread. And so I believe that perhaps, and you can just give this some thought on your own, that maybe this is really what he's saying to us. He's not saying cut out your right eye because you looked at something that you shouldn't have, or cut off your hand. But he's saying in the members, among your members, we have to purge the evil from among us. If it's me, then I need to be purged. I'm that member, I'm that hand or whatever that needs to be purged or cut off from the body, because we need to keep the camp holy and clean. And we see examples of that, of course, in the Old Testament, where Achan was and his family were cut off. They were purged because of the evil that they had done. And there are other examples as well. So I believe this is likely what Yahushua is alluding to when he talks about cutting out your right eye or cutting off your hand. Cut off because of rebellious sin. Bamidbar, Numbers, chapter 15. Bamidbar means in the wilderness. Bamidbar, in the wilderness. Shemot, names. Vayikra, and he called. Bamidbar, in the wilderness. And Devarim, words. So I might as well throw in the first one. Bereshit means in the beginning. Genesis is Bereshit, in the beginning. Okay, so Bamidbar, Numbers chapter 15. But the person who acts presumptuously, he's talking about somebody who's committed a rebellious, intentional sin, whether native born or resident foreigner, insults Yahweh. That person must be cut off from among his people. Because he has despised the word of Yahweh and he has broken the commandment, that person must be completely cut off. His iniquity will be on him. But if the community doesn't cut him off, the iniquity will be upon the community. And we've seen the community of Israel on a number of occasions pay dearly because of one person's iniquity.
Yep.
And so the purging must take place when you have rebellion in the house. Okay, next on divorce. And boy, here is a topic that is so controversial, and you hear different opinions and teachings on divorce. And I'm going to present as best I can what I see in the commandments concerning divorce. Matthew 5:31 to 32, and it has been said, whoever puts away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever puts away his wife, except for the matter of whoring or fornication, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who has been put away commits adultery. So if a man puts away his wife for any other reason, and she remarries, and she still has that vow that she made, because marriage is a vow. There's two important things about marriage I want to say today. Marriage is a vow, and we are responsible for upholding our vows, especially this vow of marriage. It's a lifelong vow, kind of like the Nazarite vow, although it doesn't have to be a lifelong vow. The Nazarite vow can be a lifelong vow, but it might be just over a period of time. Marriage is a lifetime vow, and when we commit adultery, because the essence of marriage, here's the second thing I want to say, the essence of marriage is faithfulness to one another. It's about not going outside of that relationship between a man and a woman to seek out other pleasures. And so when we commit the act outside of that relationship, we're also breaking a vow. And we've essentially broken the marriage if we do that. If we go outside, if we're not faithful. And Yahweh has given us marriage as a picture of his relationship with his people. When his people turned away from him, they essentially broke the covenant vow and are no longer in covenant with him. And he doesn't have to recognize them as his people, and he doesn't have to bless them as his people, because his people have broken away in committing the act of unfaithfulness, in turning to other gods. And so marriage is just like that. When that vow is broken and we go outside of our partner to seek out those other things, then we've broken the marriage. We have the option of forgiving one another and for reconciling and for making it right. That's not a requirement, because once somebody has broken the marriage, that person's not obligated to get back into the marriage. But the Father, who is also full of compassion and mercy and forgiveness, and if we can bring ourselves to have his heart of compassion and forgiveness and mercy, then perhaps we can fix that and make it right again, that marriage relationship, and get back into keeping that vow. And so marriages can be fixed that have been broken, but it's up to both parties to do their part and to exercise the prerogative of forgiving. And maybe sometimes that's really hard to do. Some people can't bring themselves to forgive because it's such a devastating act when we're unfaithful to our spouse. So, back to the text. Moshe said, whoever puts away his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And Yahusha says, but I say to you that whoever puts away his wife, except for the matter of fornication or adultery, makes her commit adultery, because she goes out and gets another husband, and now she's committing adultery because she's no longer with her first husband. So we need to take a deeper look at this and some other things that the Master said, and then we'll try to put these facts together and draw some sort of conclusion about it. In Matthew 19, he addresses the issue of divorce again. Some Pharisees came to him in order to test him. They asked, is it lawful to divorce a wife for any cause? And he answered, have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and will be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so they are no longer two, but one flesh. And therefore what Elohim has joined together, let no one separate. So here, from the beginning, it was the intention of Elohim that the two become one. And that what he puts together, that no one would separate this. That it's, again, it's a vow, it's a commitment that a man makes to a woman and a woman makes to a man. And so there's no good reason, apart from breaking the very essence of that relationship, there doesn't seem to be any good reason why man should be able to separate what Elohim has brought together. And they said to him, the Pharisees said to him, why then did Moshe command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her? And Yehusha said to them, Moshe permitted you to divorce your wives because of your hard hearts. But from the beginning it was not this way. Now I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for immorality, or fornication, and marries another commits adultery. Okay, so let's go back to what Moshe actually did say. And that's in Devarim, which means words. Devarim 24. If a man marries a woman and she does not please him, but he has found something offensive, I underline that phrase because I want to dig into that expression as well. He has found something offensive in her, then he may draw up a divorce document, give it to her, and evict her from his house. And when she has left him, she may go and become someone else's wife. So this is what the Pharisees are interpreting as, Moshe gave us permission to divorce our wives. But we have to look at this expression, something offensive, and find out what he means by that. As the reason why a man wants to let his wife go and divorce her. So the Hebrew here is ervat davar. Davar, we just talked about davar, devarim. It's a word, it's a matter, it's an issue. So he's talking about some certain type of issue that the man has with the woman. The word ervat is commonly translated as naked. And it's a metaphor for sexual sin. In Devarim, Leviticus chapter 18, we read almost the whole thing a couple weeks ago, and I used a lot of euphemisms as I translated that, as I went through that passage of Devarim. What did I say it was?
And called.
What is it?
Leviticus.
Leviticus. Oh, Vayikra. Yeah, Vayikra 18. And where it says, that you don't marry your aunt, your niece, it goes through this long list of relatives that it is improper, and he calls it abomination that somebody hooks up with. So I used a euphemism as I went through that passage, but the literal Hebrew all throughout that passage is usually like 20 or 30 times is this word ervat. It refers to the nakedness of a person, and it's a euphemism for sexual conduct. Okay? Ervat, nakedness. So when Moshe says, if a man marries a woman and she does not please him because he has found something offensive, it's an issue of immorality that he's finding in this woman. There's something. Maybe there aren't two witnesses, but he discovers something that is of a sexual nature. And therefore he wants to divorce this woman. So the instruction is, draw up a divorce document, give it to her, and send her away. She's free to go out and marry because she hasn't been convicted of anything because there weren't 2 or 3 witnesses. But the man knows there was something wrong. Okay? So you can't convict somebody without 2 or 3 witnesses, and yet this man knows that there was something offensive in her. There was a sexual issue that was wrong. And so in that case, the man can write up a divorce certificate and send her away. And then she's free because she hasn't been convicted. She's free to go remarry. Whether or not she's committing adultery, well, he sent her away, so now she's free and clear. And she can remarry. He says so right here. She can become someone else's wife. So that's the backdrop into this discussion, first in Matthew 5 and then Matthew 19, where the Pharisees get into it with him about, can a man divorce his wife for any cause? And he keeps emphasizing the point about it was not that way from the beginning, that divorce was an option, except in the case of this sexual thing, this sexual issue that's going on. And in that case, a man can divorce his wife. So that's, I approach this subject looking for other ways that it was lawful for divorce to take place, because sometimes people are incompatible, sometimes there's violence in the home, and there are things that seem to be intolerable and may be very well intolerable in a relationship between a man and a woman, and yet the Torah does not seem to address any of these other issues. So I cannot sit here and tell you that the Torah says it's okay to divorce for any reason. The Pharisees were looking for other reasons, but Messiah wouldn't give it to them. He said, you're talking about when Moshe gave us permission to divorce, by giving a divorce document, but look at what he says. It's because there was something offensive in her. There was a sexual matter over which he was allowed to divorce her. So I can't find anything that says it's okay to divorce, except for the fact that, let's look at something that Paul said. And this is very interesting, because this is kind of an out, but it's not an out. If you feel like you need to get out of your marriage, it is and it isn't. Because here's what Paul said. To the married I give this command, not I, but Yahusha, or the Lord. He says, but the Lord. This expression he uses in a couple of places. When he says, I, not the Lord, he's referring to his own judgment. That the Lord, Yahusha, has not spoken to this particular issue. He's giving his own mishpat, his own judgment in this matter that the rest of the scriptures do not give specific reference to. So he says, I, not the Lord. In this case, he says, not I, but the Lord. And I've translated it here, Yahusha. Because he's saying here that Yahusha spoke to this issue. We don't have a record of it in the Gospels, but Paul wouldn't be lying about this either, because his readers would have known. And so we have to take him at his word that the Lord, Yahusha, did speak to this issue to the married. He said a wife should not divorce a husband, but if she does, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband should not divorce his wife. And that's consistent with the rest of what he spoke about divorce, is that only in this issue of infidelity is it lawful to divorce. And so if a man or a woman feels the need to get out of that relationship or get away, they can do so on the stipulation that they don't remarry, but they work toward reconciliation, because the Father hates divorce. The Father wants his people to be reconciled and to make things right with one another. And so the woman can leave, she can divorce her husband, but she can't remarry unless her husband were to die. She has to try to reconcile with her husband, and if that never happens, she has to remain unmarried. And I know that's a hard word, and I want to give you something easier, but I can't, because this is what the word says. So I have to faithfully represent what the Torah tells us, what the Master Yahusha tells us, and even here what Paul tells us. And that is that we you need to remain together and reconcile things, or separate and reconcile things. And so that's the word I have on divorce. And it's a hard word, but it's a faithful word. Deuteronomy 22. There's another command in the Torah about this issue of divorce. So I want to look at this as well. Deuteronomy 22. Devarim. Deuteronomy 22. He says, if a man takes a wife and after sleeping with her dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name because he thinks that there is something wrong with her, and that kind of coincides with the ervat davar that we spoke of in Deuteronomy 24. So he gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, and when I approached her, I did not find proof of her virginity. She's been active. And then the young woman's father and mother shall bring to the town's elders at the gate proof that she was a virgin. Her father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin. But here is the proof of my daughter's virginity. And then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. So if there's evidence, and I'm not going to go into detail, you probably understand what this means, that there's evidence in the cloth that she was a virgin. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the young woman's father, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. And now listen to this. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. And so there's the word again. She was not guilty of this infidelity, and therefore the vow, the commitment he's made to her, he must keep for the rest of his or her life. If, however, this charge is true and no proof of the young woman's virginity can be found, and she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and then there the men of her town shall stone her to death. A harsh word. She has done an outrageous thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil. There's that phrase again. You must purge the evil from among you. Back to Devarim 24, because I want to read a little further in this passage where Moshe describes the divorce certificate. It says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, that ervat davar, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her out of his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her away from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of Yahweh. Do not bring sin upon the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you as an inheritance. So she can't return to her first husband because she's been with a second husband. And that kind of lays the groundwork for making this statement that if you've left your spouse and your spouse marries another, it seems to me, if I'm thinking this through correctly, that you have no obligation to return or to stay unmarried because your spouse has made the choice of marrying another. Does that make sense? Does that follow logically what I just read?
Follows logically, yeah.
Yeah. But you can't return to your first spouse because that would be an abomination. So that's no longer on the table. So it seems to me that if your spouse that you've divorced or left gets into another relationship, then that sets you free. And that's the way, I mean, it doesn't exactly say it that way, but that's the way I'm understanding it. And so I just wanted to lay that out there as well as, something to consider, something to ponder, something to seek the Father on. Because we all want to have understanding about divorce and remarriage. We all want to understand the Father's heart on these things. And I think there's enough evidence to say what I've said today. There's more that Paul says about relationships. I think it's in 1 Corinthians. And maybe we'll save that for another day, where he talks about the various scenarios that he has to deal with and people ask him questions on. So I'm going to leave that topic for now. Maybe we can dig into it further if you want to over lunch, and even on down the road, because I know I haven't exhausted this subject, but I've just tried to, as faithfully as possible, represent what the Torah and what the Messiah taught on these subjects. Okay, so let's move on. Matthew 5:33 through 37. And Yahushua here is dealing with the issue of taking oaths. Again, he said, "You heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform your oaths to Yahweh.'" So what we need to see in this first verse here is that the word he uses here, the Greek word, means to break an oath. You shall not swear falsely. And that's a faithful translation of the Greek word. But you shall perform your oaths. And the reason I'm making this point is because as he describes taking oaths, he doesn't use the same Greek word here, but he uses a word, but he doesn't use the word falsely. He talks about oaths. But I'm suggesting to you that he's referring to this commandment when he talks about taking oaths. And what he says hereafter in these next few verses refers to swearing falsely, not just to swearing, but to swearing falsely. And we're going to look at swearing, what proper oath-taking is, and what improper oath-taking is, in kind of a brief summary of that topic. So, "But I say to you," he said, "do not swear at all, neither by the heaven, because it is Elohim's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor swear falsely by your head, because you are not able to make one hair white or black. But let your word yea be yea, and your no be no, and what goes beyond these is from the wicked one." So why is he talking about swearing by all these different objects? Because the Torah never tells us to swear by any other object, even the holy place or any other holy thing. And I'll show you this verse in a minute. It says, all of your oaths are to be sworn in the name of Yahweh. So you're swearing and taking all of your oaths on the name of Yahweh, but not by these other things. It's the religious leadership that tried to get people familiar or comfortable with the idea of swearing by Jerusalem, or swearing by the throne, or swearing by the altar, or swearing by yourself, or swearing on any other object, because then they could break that, because then it wasn't the same as dishonoring Yahweh by swearing in his name. But if you swear by some object, it's kind of like the oath isn't as binding. You could break that oath. It didn't matter. But if you broke an oath in the name of Yahweh, then you're breaking something important. So Messiah said, don't swear by any of these other things. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Notice he didn't say, do not swear by the Father's name, falsely, by the Father's name. Because then that really would have been transgression. Okay, so ellipsis is used here. And I think some of your other translations will read without, I've inserted the word falsely in there because of this ellipsis. An ellipsis is to omit a word or phrase which is necessary for a complete syntactical construction. In other words, a complete thought of what's being said, but not necessarily for understanding. So we might omit a word when we're repeating something over and over, but we understand in the context that we're talking about this specific thing. In other words, swearing falsely and not just swearing. So ellipsis was used here. The word falsely was not included, but it was understood. We were to understand that he's talking about taking a false oath. It's a common device for communicators. The speaker assumes the hearer understands the context and therefore can fill in the missing word or phrase because the context demands it. And so here's what the Torah says about swearing and taking oaths. Devarim, words. Chapter 6, verse 13, you must revere Yahweh your Elohim and serve him and take oaths using only his name. And then Devarim, words. Chapter 10, verse 20. See, we're all getting familiar with these Hebrew words. The Devarim. Revere Yahweh your Elohim, serve him, be loyal to him, and take oaths only in his name. And so we have these two and several other places where we're told to take all of our oaths in his name. And so we used to think that putting our hand on the Bible if we're going to appear in court might be wrong because Jesus said, don't take oaths. But we misunderstood that passage in Matthew 5. He wasn't saying, don't take an oath. He's saying, don't take an oath falsely. Don't take a false oath. Don't take an oath intending to break that oath. In other words, don't lie. Tell the truth. And that's really what putting your hand on the Bible's all about. It's about, right, telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So when we take our oath, the judge will allow us to take our oath in the name of Yahweh. He lets people take, put their hand on the Quran, for crying out loud. And so the judge will typically be lenient in that matter, and if our religious practice calls for it, and in this case, our Father calls us to do it, we can take our oath in the name of Yahweh when we swear an oath in court. Here's another one. You must not swear falsely in my name. Miqra, and he called, Leviticus, so that you do not profane the name of Yahweh, or the name of your Elohim. I am Yahweh. And then again in Devarim 23, when you make a vow to Yahweh your Elohim, you must not delay in fulfilling it, for otherwise he will surely hold you accountable as a sinner. So when we take our oaths, we're accountable to keep our oaths. And when we swear, when we take an oath, we're supposed to take it in his name, and in no other name and on no other object, because all the rest of those oaths, well, we're not permitted to do it. I mean, I guess I can just leave it at that. He tells us to swear all of our oaths in his name. So that's what we should do, and not do what the Pharisees tried to get us to do. So another word about oaths from Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, chapter 12. But they must carefully learn to follow the religious practices of my people. Once they taught my people to swear their oaths using the name of the Elohim, Baal. These are the false prophets. Swear by Baal. But then they must swear oaths using my name. Because if they're returning, if they're repenting, they have to swear their oaths by my name, saying, as surely as Yahweh lives, I swear. If they do these things, then they will be included among my people I call my own. But I will completely uproot and destroy any of those nations that will not pay heed, says Yahweh. So even for people that are repenting and coming back into covenant relationship with the Almighty, they need to change their habits of swearing and taking oaths and swear in the name of Yahweh, because he is the true Elohim. And that's all I have on taking oaths. On retaliation. And I think we have this one and a word about loving your enemy at the end. So I think we're down to the last two topics. You heard that it was said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Remember we talked about that one as well. We talked that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is the limit of of what the law will allow us to pay back, to make a thing right. In other words, the punishment must be according to the crime, right? You can't punish beyond the magnitude of the crime. You can't take someone's eye out because they took your tooth out. That would be unequal, and it would be a greater punishment than the actual crime deserves. So an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is kind of a limitation that the Torah gives for retaliation, or for getting vengeance, or making things right. But I say to you, and Messiah says this, do not resist the wicked. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And he who wishes to sue you and take away your inner garment, let him have your outer garment as well. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and from him who wishes to borrow from you, do not turn away. So why is he talking about not resisting the wicked? Because an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is retaliation for an injustice done to you. But he's saying you don't have to demand that justice for the injustice done to you. We don't have to make that demand of anybody. We can forgive, and this is the heart of the Father. It's in not resisting the wicked. In other words, forgiving the wicked for the wrong that they may have done to us. Forgiving a brother for the wrong that they might have done to us. We don't have to demand an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. A hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. What's the other one? And I forget. There's like 5 or 6 things listed. We can exercise the heart of the Father and forgive, and that's what Yahusha is referring to here. And it is the heart of the Father. It's the compassion of Elohim. It's the forgiveness of Elohim. It's those weightier issues that he talks about, that are taught about in the Torah, that we need to not just comply with the outward simple level of the Torah, but we need to exercise also the character of Elohim, because those are the deeper things. The commandments are to help us to understand the heart of the Father, but the heart of the Father also includes forgiveness and release.
Mercy.
And mercy. Hallelujah, yes. So, with that in mind, what Yahusha is describing here is, as he's digging deeper into the Torah, the fact that you don't have to demand an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That you can release it and let it go. Whatever offense has been done to you. Him who asks of you, give to him. Don't turn away a brother, don't turn away even a non-brother, but give to them what they want. And what you're really doing is you're exercising and demonstrating the love of Elohim, the love of Yahushua Messiah to that person, by showing the compassion and the mercy and the love of Elohim to that person. So Shemot describes this issue again. And let me just quote it, because I alluded to it and I didn't do a good job of covering the basis. So let's just read it from Shemot 21. If men fight and hit a pregnant woman and her child is born prematurely, but there is no serious injury, he will surely be punished in accordance with what the woman's husband will put on him, and he will pay what the court decides. So it's up to the court. It's, the man can ask for a certain judgment, but the courts decide what that judgment is going to be. And so he has to pay whatever the judges decide is going to be the proper recompense for hitting the pregnant woman, for hitting his wife, when no serious injury occurred. But if there is serious injury, then you will give a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It's all according to the severity of the damage done. And that you can't exact more than that from the offender. If a man strikes the eye of his servant or the eye of his female servant so that he destroys it, he will let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his servant or the tooth of his female servant, he will let him go free for the sake of the tooth. So this is a little different scenario where a man has a servant, he strikes out his eye or his tooth, he has to let that servant go free. The servant is no longer lawfully required to serve his master. The master has to set that servant free. And in another place where it talks about setting your servant free, it commands the righteous man to generously give to that servant as he's released and he goes out on his own. Generously give and supply for that servant that you're setting free. And so here, in this case, I assume that is also true, that if a master is forced because he hit his servant to release his servant, then he's also to give that servant, money or substance so that that servant can go out and get started on his own. Good will come to him who is generous and lends freely, who conducts his affairs with justice. Psalm 112, verse 5. And a generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. And so that generous way of sending off your servant into his freedom is something that will prosper you. And it's what the Father requires, is for us to be generous with one another, especially in this case. And that's why I brought up these two verses, to show that the releasing of a servant needs to be generously done and send him away with substance. And our final topic that we're going to cover today, it's on love. You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So, when I studied this in the past, I searched high and low to find out where the Torah said to hate your enemy. It doesn't say that. I found there was a word that is kind of equivalent to hating with regard to your enemy, but it never said to hate your enemy in the Torah. And so I thought, okay, surely it must be. Well, David said, I hate those who transgress your law. There's a couple things David said in the Psalms about hating somebody. But that kind of hate is a hatred of the deed and not so much the person doing the deed. So what we really hate, we're supposed to love Elohim and hate sin, right? We're supposed to hate the evil deed. And so if our enemy is performing those evil deeds, then there's a certain hatred directed toward them. But we're not commanded to hate our enemies. And so what I realized was that Yahushua was referring to what the rabbis and the Pharisees were teaching to the people. Not what the Torah itself teaches, but they were saying hate your enemy because I guess they had reason to hate their enemies, their oppressors. They didn't like being in bondage. They didn't like being under some other nation's rule. But yet Yahweh sent them to that because of their transgression of the Torah. So that's what the Pharisees taught, to hate your enemy, but that's not what the Torah teaches. And so that's when I realized that this particular section that we're covering today, when you have heard that it was said by them of old, and now I say to you, it's not necessarily what the Torah really taught accurately, though what you heard it said by them of old. But it was what the leadership taught that the Torah was saying. And Yahushua was there to correct that, and to dig deeper and to show the fuller intention of the Torah, and therefore to correct what had been taught to them. So this one kind of bears that point out, because the Torah never said hate your enemy, but they said it, and now he's saying, I say to you, love your enemies, bless those cursing you, do good to those hating you, and pray for those insulting you and persecuting you, so that you become sons of the Father in the heavens. Because he makes his sun rise on the wicked and on the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. So Elohim, to a certain extent, treats us all equally, in the sense that, as described here, the sun comes up, the rains come down. There are things that are common to the wicked and to the righteous that Elohim provides. But when it comes to his favor and righteousness and justice and those things that only come with having a relationship with him through his covenant and through agreeing to let him be Elohim and that we will be his people, there are those certain things that only apply to the righteous. And so what he's saying here is that there are certain things that even Elohim does for the wicked that he does for you. And so there are certain things that you should also do for the wicked that Elohim does for the wicked, and that is to love your enemy and not hate them. Because Elohim loves them, Elohim wants them to come to repentance, and he gives them opportunity to do so and to come into relationship. And so that's in the Father's heart, and that needs to be in our heart as well, to bless our enemies. And here's something else interesting. If you love those loving you, what reward have you? Are the tax collectors not doing the same also? And if you greet your brothers only, what do you do more than others? Are the tax collectors not doing so also? And therefore be perfect as your Father in the heavens is perfect. So in other words, there has to be something about us that sets us apart from the rest of the world. And that's the showing of love even to our enemies and to those who hate us. If we shine that light to the world, then they will recognize that we are truly the disciples of Yahusha. And so it's not enough just to do the same good deeds that the rest of the world does, but we have to separate ourselves and go beyond the world's standard of loving other people and take on the standard that Elohim gave us of loving other people. And that's the standard that he himself lives by, loving the whole world so that he gave his only begotten Son, and loving those who hate him and trying to draw them into repentance. Another verse on this: if your enemy is hungry, this is from the Proverbs, and I think it's quoted by Peter. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. That's loving your enemy. That's not hating your enemy. And so there it is in the writings, the teaching that we're to love our enemies. We're to help our enemies, give them food and water. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and Yahweh will reward you. And I think this heaping coals on his head is a reference to a conviction. It's bringing conviction to this individual. You know, when they did wrong to you, but you're doing good to them, it's convicting that maybe they shouldn't have done wrong to you, or maybe they need to listen to what you're communicating to them by way of repenting of the way that they handle their relationships with others. Mm-hmm. So there's an example of loving your enemy. James says this: with the tongue we praise our Master and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in Elohim's likeness, and out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. And the reason I included this verse is it's because we want to bless our brothers, and rightly so. And if we want to curse our enemies or hate our enemies, then two different things are coming out of our mouth: praise and cursing, and that's not supposed to be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. Yahusha said, love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And so here, loving your neighbor, and your neighbor could be an enemy. Your neighbor is whoever is within, eye shot or earshot of yourself. That's your neighbor. It's your fellow man. And so we're to love our fellow man as ourselves. And that's what the Torah really teaches. Not to hate people that hate us, but to love all as Yahweh has loved us. Last point. The last verse says, therefore be perfect as your Father in the heavens is perfect. And so I quote here Psalm 18. As for Elohim, his way is perfect. The word of Yahweh is flawless. And so make that poetic connection there. Perfect, flawless. This is what perfect means, to be flawless. He is a shield for all who take refuge in him. For who is Elohim besides Yahweh, and who is the rock except our Elohim? It is Elohim who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. So because Elohim is perfect, or flawless, the writer, I presume Psalm 18, this was David, he says, I make my way perfect because Elohim is perfect. Okay? So David was agreeing with this instruction that we should be perfect as Elohim is perfect. The word tamim is the Hebrew used here. It means complete, sound, or whole, unscathed, intact, healthy, well-behaved, guiltless, and blameless. It's the same word that's used of the Passover lamb. It's to be blameless. It's to be tamim. It's to be perfect. Guiltless. There's no fault in it. And so this is the kind of blameless or perfection that we're called to. We're not going to be perfect as Elohim in the sense that we're going to be Elohim, because we're created beings. But the standard of perfect here is to be blameless. It's not to be, I don't know, whatever our thoughts are on what it means to be perfect. It probably doesn't mean that. It just means to be blameless or guiltless. It means to have no fault. No one can bring an accusation against you because you're blameless. And there are two men that I cite here, and this is our last slide, so we're done after this. Noah, Genesis, Bereshit 6:9. This is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless. He was tamim, blameless, guiltless, among the people of his time, and he walked with Elohim. This is the standard. He was not walking in sin, but he was fully in a righteous fellowship with the Almighty and walking with Elohim. And also Avram in Genesis 17:1. When Avram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to him and said, I am Elohim Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. So Avram was called to have this status about his life and his walk before Elohim. He was to be blameless. He was to be without fault, so that he could properly light the light of Elohim to the world and be a proper witness to all the nations around him, so that Elohim could walk with him and bless him. And so this is what Yahusha means when he says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It means to be without fault, without sin, not walking in sin, but having all forgiven and washed in the blood, and then walking uprightly in accordance with the commandments of the Almighty. So that's how Yahusha is upholding the Torah and the prophets, is he's explaining, and we'll see this throughout the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, he's explaining what it means to keep Torah and to do the things that the Father calls us to. What say you? What say you?
I have a lot of work to do.
We all do.